The stampede thundered across the Arizona desert like the wrath of God himself, a churning mass of wild horses kicking up enough dust to blot out the afternoon sun. And Ella Harrison knew she had maybe 30 seconds before they trampled straight through her father's camp and destroyed everything they owned. Her mare danced nervously beneath her as Ella's eyes tracked the lead stallion, a magnificent paint with a coat like storm clouds and lightning. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from when she was 12 years old, teaching her to rope from horseback in the gentler days, before consumption had stolen her mother and left them wandering from town to town chasing work and survival. She was 22 now, in the summer of 1878, and those lessons were all she had left of the man her father used to be before grief had hollowed him out. The horses were maybe 200 yards out now, close enough that she could feel the vibration through the ground. Their camp sat in a small depression near Ash Fork, Arizona, where they had stopped 3 days ago so her father could recover from another coughing fit that had left him weak as a newborn foal. Their wagon, their supplies, the medicine she had scrimped and saved to buy, all of it would be destroyed if those horses came through. Ella didn't think. She kicked her mare into a dead gallop, angling to intercept the herd. The wind tore at her dark braid and stung her eyes as she leaned low over her horse's neck, her rope already in her hands. She had maybe one chance at this, one moment where she could get close enough to the lead stallion to make the throw count. The world narrowed to the rhythm of hoofbeats and the weight of braided leather in her palm. She could see the wild intelligence in the stallion's eyes now, see the way he led the herd with absolute authority. If she could catch him, turn him, the rest would follow. If she missed, she would likely be trampled alongside everything else she cared about. Ella stood in her stirrups, her mare running full out beneath her, and let the rope fly. It sailed through the dust-thick air in a perfect arc, and for one crystalline moment time seemed to stop. Then the loop settled around the stallion's neck, and Ella sat back hard, wrapping the rope around her saddle horn as her mare planted her hooves and slid. The stallion reared, fighting the rope, but Ella held firm even as her arms screamed in protest. She kept the pressure steady, turning the big horse, and slowly, gradually, the stampede began to curve away from the camp. The thunder of hooves shifted direction, sweeping past in a wide arc that took them a safe 100 yards from the wagon. Ella's arms shook with exhaustion as she kept the stallion turning, kept him moving in a wide circle until the herd's momentum had spent itself, and the horses began to slow, then stop, milling about in confusion. Only then did she ease the tension on the rope, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. That was when she saw him. He sat on a massive buckskin horse at the top of the ridge overlooking the valley, and even from a distance she could see he was built like something carved from the mountains themselves. Broad shoulders, a chest that seemed to take up half the horizon, arms thick with muscle visible even through his leather shirt. His hair was dark and long enough to brush his collar, and as she watched, still breathing hard from the effort of turning the herd, he lifted one hand and tipped his hat to her. The gesture was simple, respectful, acknowledging what she had done. Then he turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge as quickly as he had appeared. Ella sat frozen for a long moment, the rope still in her hands, trying to process what had just happened. The stallion shifted beneath the rope, reminding her that she still had a problem to solve. She couldn't just let the horse go, not after going through all that effort to stop the stampede. But she also couldn't hold him indefinitely, and her mare was exhausted from the run. She was still trying to figure out her next move when her father appeared, leading their pack horse. Thomas Harrison looked older than his 48 years, worn down by grief and illness, but his eyes were clear as he took in the scene. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever seen," he said, his voice rough from the coughing that plagued him. "Probably both." "They were going to destroy the camp," Ella said simply. She nodded toward the stallion, who had settled somewhat but still eyed her with wild suspicion. "What do I do with him now?" Her father studied the horse with an experienced eye. "That is a fine animal. Worth good money if we could gentle him enough to sell, but we do not have the time or the resources for that kind of work. So I should let him go. I suppose you should." Thomas moved closer, careful not to spook the stallion, "though it seems a waste after what you went through to catch him." "I did not catch him to keep him," Ella said. "I caught him to save our camp. Even so." Her father reached up and squeezed her shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. "Your mother would have been proud. That was some of the finest riding and roping I have seen in 30 years. Warmth spread through Ella's chest at the words. Praise from her father had become scarce in the years since her mother's death. She carefully loosened the rope from around the stallion's neck, ready to pull it free and let the horse go, when movement on the ridge caught her eye. The man was back, leading his buckskin down the slope with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his whole life in wild country. As he drew closer, Ella could see she had not been wrong about his size. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to stretch forever and arms corded with muscle. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of beard and eyes the color of creek water in winter. "That was some impressive roping," he called out as he approached. His voice was deep, rough as gravel but somehow warm. "Do not see many folks who can make a throw like that from a full gallop." "Thank you," Ella said, suddenly aware of how dusty and disheveled she must look. "I had good motivation." The man's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I imagine you did. That herd would have flattened your camp." He stopped his horse a respectful distance away, his eyes moving from Ella to her father to the stallion still on the end of her rope. "Name is Henry Thornton. I have been tracking this herd for about 3 days now." "Thomas Harrison," her father said, moving forward to shake Henry's hand. "This is my daughter Ella, and I take it that stallion belongs to you, in a manner of speaking." Henry dismounted with fluid grace despite his size. "He belongs to himself, really, but I have been hired to bring him and about 30 of his mares to a ranch outside Prescott. They broke through a fence 2 weeks back and have been running wild ever since." Ella processed this information, understanding dawning. "So we just caught your horse for you." "You did indeed." Henry moved closer to the stallion, his movements calm and measured. The horse's ears flicked toward him, and some of the tension left the animal's posture. "Though I would not have attempted what you just did. That was dangerous as hell, if you will pardon my language, miss." "It was necessary," Ella said, lifting her chin. She did not appreciate being told what she already knew, even if the criticism came wrapped in a compliment. Henry's Winter Creek eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition or challenge or something Ella could not quite name. Necessary and dangerous are not mutually exclusive, but I will not argue with the results. He turned his attention to the stallion, running his hands over the horse's neck and shoulders, checking for injuries. "You did not hurt him. That is fine work." "She learned from the best," Thomas said, and there was pride in his voice that made Ella's throat tight. Henry nodded, then looked at the rope still looped around the stallion's neck. "I have a lead rope on my saddle. If you would allow me to replace yours, I can take him off your hands." Ella carefully held the stallion steady while Henry retrieved his rope and made the switch. His hands were large and capable, moving with the confidence of someone who had handled difficult horses before. When he stood close to her mare, Ella could smell leather and wood smoke and something else, something wild and clean like pine trees and mountain air. "Where are you folks headed?" Henry asked as he secured his rope. "Nowhere in particular," Thomas admitted. "We have been following work where we can find it. I was a ranch foreman once, but—" He trailed off, and Ella knew he was thinking of the coughing fits that had cost him the last 3 jobs he had managed to get. Henry was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I could use some help gathering the rest of this herd. The ranch owner offered me a bonus if I bring them all in, but it is hard work for one man. If you two were interested, I would split the bonus with you." Ella's heart leaped at the offer. They needed money desperately, needed it for medicine and food and all the 100 small necessities of survival, but she forced herself to ask the practical question. How long would it take? Maybe a week, perhaps 2 if the horses proved difficult. Henry's gaze moved to Thomas, and Ella saw understanding in those creek water eyes. He had noticed her father's fragile condition, had seen the telltale signs of illness. "It is not overly strenuous work, mostly tracking and smart roping. And there is a line cabin about 5 miles north of here where we could base ourselves. Roof, walls, a decent well." "That sounds almost too good to be true," Thomas said, but there was hope in his voice. "It is honest work for honest pay," Henry replied. "And after what I just witnessed, I know Miss Harrison here has the skills to be useful. The question is whether you are interested." Ella looked at her father, saw the exhaustion in his face and the way he was trying to hide how much the last few days had cost him. A cabin with walls and a roof, even for just a week or 2, would give him a chance to rest properly, and the money would be a godsend. "We are interested," she said, making the decision for both of them. Thomas shot her a look, but he did not contradict her. Henry nodded, satisfaction crossing his features. "Good. Let me get this stallion secured with the others, and then I will show you to the cabin. We can start fresh in the morning." He mounted his buckskin with the stallion's lead rope in hand, and Ella watched the way he sat his horse, easy and natural as breathing. There was something about him that drew her attention, something beyond his obvious physical strength. He moved with quiet confidence, comfortable in his own skin in a way that Ella envied. As Henry rode toward where the herd had settled, Ella turned her mare back toward their camp. Her father fell in beside her, and they rode in silence for a few moments before he spoke. "That was risky, agreeing so quickly." "We need the money," Ella said simply. "True enough." Thomas coughed, a wet sound that made Ella's stomach clench with worry. "And I suppose I would rather take a risk on an honest man than keep wandering until we run out of supplies entirely." "He seems honest," Ella said, though she wondered how she could be sure. Something in Henry Thornton's direct gaze and straightforward manner made her want to trust him, but she had learned young that wanting something did not make it true. They broke camp quickly, loading their meager possessions into the wagon. By the time they finished, Henry had returned with the stallion secured to a line he had rigged between 2 trees near where the herd grazed. He led them north through the desert landscape, past towering saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings painted gold by the late afternoon sun. The line cabin turned out to be sturdier than Ella had expected. A solid structure built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. The inside was dusty but dry, with 2 rope beds built into the walls, a table, and a fireplace that looked like it would draw well. "I have been staying here for the past couple nights," Henry explained as he helped Thomas unload the wagon. "There is a lean-to out back for the horses, and the well water is good. Not fancy, but better than sleeping under the stars when the weather turns." "It is perfect," Ella said honestly. Anything with walls and a roof felt like luxury after weeks of camping rough. Henry showed them where to store their supplies and where the firewood was stacked, then excused himself to check on the horses. Ella watched him go, noted the powerful line of his shoulders and the way his long hair caught the fading sunlight. She felt something flutter in her chest, something she firmly told herself was just gratitude for his help. That night, they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread around the cabin's table, and Henry proved to be a surprisingly good conversationalist. He had spent most of his life in the mountains, he told them, trapping and hunting and occasionally hiring on as muscle when ranchers needed help with problem animals or difficult situations. "I prefer the high country," he said, his deep voice warm in the firelight. "But I come down to the desert sometimes when the work is good. The mountains get lonely in winter." "Do you have family?" Thomas asked. Henry shook his head. "My parents died when I was young, raised by an old trapper who taught me everything I know about living in wild country. He passed 5 years back, and I have been on my own since." There was no self-pity in his words, just simple fact, but Ella felt a pang of sympathy nonetheless. She knew what it was to lose family, knew the hollow ache that never quite went away. "What about you folks?" Henry asked, his eyes on Ella. "How did you end up wandering Arizona?" Thomas explained about their life before, when he had been a respected ranch foreman in New Mexico, and they had lived in a real house with proper furniture. He talked about Ella's mother dying, about losing job after job as his health deteriorated, about the slow slide from respectability to barely scraping by. Henry listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes or false comfort. When Thomas finished, he simply nodded and said, "Life has a way of knocking you down sometimes. The measure of a person is whether they get back up." "Ella keeps getting us back up," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that made Ella look away, uncomfortable with the weight of his regard. "I would have given up a long time ago if not for her." "Well then," Henry said, raising his tin cup of coffee in a salute, "to not giving up." They drank to that, and Ella felt some of the tension she had been carrying for weeks ease slightly. Maybe this would work out. Maybe they would earn enough to buy more medicine, to buy a little breathing room to figure out their next move. Maybe, just maybe, their luck was finally turning. That night, she lay in one of the rope beds while her father snored softly in the other, and Henry took first watch outside with the horses. Through the window she could see his silhouette against the star-bright sky, solid and reassuring. She thought about the way he had tipped his hat to her after she caught the stallion, that simple gesture of respect that had warmed something in her chest she had not known was cold. Sleep took her gently, and for the first time in weeks, she did not dream of loss and failure. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and Ella woke to find Henry already up and cooking breakfast over the fireplace. The cabin was warm despite the early hour, and pale gold light streamed through the windows. "Morning," Henry said when he noticed her stirring. "Figured we could use a good meal before we start work." Ella sat up, suddenly aware that her braid had come half undone in the night and she probably looked like something the cat dragged in. "You did not have to do that. I was up anyway." He flipped the bacon with practiced ease. "Your father is still sleeping. Figured I would let him rest as long as possible." Gratitude washed through Ella at his consideration. She rose and quickly rebraided her hair, then moved to help with breakfast. They worked in companionable silence, and Ella found herself hyper-aware of his presence, of the way he moved in the small space, of the warmth radiating from his large frame. Thomas woke as they were finishing, looking better rested than he had in days. They ate together as the sun rose higher, and Henry laid out the plan for the day. They would start by scouting the area, looking for signs of the scattered mares. Once they located the horses, They would work on slowly gathering them back toward the stallion, using his presence to settle and attract the mares. "It will take patience," Henry said. "Wild horses spook easy, and if we push too hard we will just scatter them further." "I understand," Ella said. She had helped gather horses before, back when her father still had steady work. They set out after breakfast, leaving Thomas at the cabin to rest and keep an eye on the stallion. Henry led Ella east toward a series of rocky canyons where he thought some of the mares might have taken shelter. As they rode, he pointed out tracks and signs that Ella would have missed, reading the desert like a book. "You are good at this," she said after he identified where 3 horses had passed through based on nothing more than some disturbed rocks and a few bent grass stems. "Had a good teacher," Henry replied. "Old John used to say that wilderness will tell you everything you need to know if you learn to listen properly." Sounds like he was a wise man. He was, cantankerous as hell and meaner than a rattlesnake when he wanted to be, but wise. Henry's mouth curved in a small smile at the memory. "He would have liked you, I think. He always respected folks who could handle themselves." They found the first group of mares in a box canyon about 2 hours later, a cluster of 6 nervous horses that shied away at their approach. Henry held up a hand, stopping Ella before they got too close. "We do not want to corner them," he said quietly. "Better to let them see us, get used to our presence, than let them move out on their own terms. We will follow at a distance, guide them back toward the cabin." It was slow, patient work that required constant attention and good instincts. They spent hours carefully maneuvering the horses, never pushing too hard, always giving them room to feel like they were making their own choices. Ella found herself impressed by Henry's skill, the way he seemed to understand exactly how much pressure to apply and when to back off. It was late afternoon by the time they got the 6 mares back within sight of the cabin and the stallion. The big paint horse called out and the mares answered, their nervousness giving way to recognition. Henry had rigged another rope line and they carefully guided the mares into the makeshift corral. "That is good work for one day," Henry said as they finished securing the line. "If we can find groups this size, we will have them all gathered in less than a week." Ella wiped sweat from her forehead, tired but satisfied. "How many are still out there?" 24 by my count. We have the stallion and now 6 mares, so we need to find 18 more. Thomas had dinner waiting when they got back to the cabin, a venison stew he had made from supplies in Henry's packs. They ate hungrily, and Ella found herself laughing at one of Henry's stories about a particularly stubborn mountain goat he had once tried to track. 3 days I followed that animal," he said, shaking his head. 3 days through country rough enough to break your heart, and in the end it just walked right past me like I was not even there. Old John laughed himself sick when I came back empty-handed." "Sounds like the goat won that round," Thomas said, smiling. "Oh, it absolutely did. I learned my lesson, though. Sometimes the smartest thing to do is know when you are beaten." After dinner, Ella walked down to the well to wash up, and she was surprised when Henry followed her out into the evening air. "I wanted to thank you," he said, leaning against the well's stone wall. "You were a real help today, made the work go twice as fast as it would have on my own." "I should be thanking you," Ella replied. "We needed this work badly." Henry was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Your father is sicker than he is letting on, is he not?" Ella's first instinct was to deny it, to protect her father's pride and their privacy. But something about Henry's direct gaze and gentle tone made the truth spill out. "Yes, it is consumption. We have been trying to manage it, but medicine costs money we do not have." "I figured it was something like that." Henry straightened, his impressive frame blocking out some of the sunset. There is a doctor in Prescott when we deliver these horses. A good one from what I hear. Maybe he could help. Maybe, Ella said, though she did not let herself hope too much. They had seen doctors before, and none of them had been able to do much beyond prescribe expensive medicines that only slowed the disease, never stopped it. Henry reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and squeezed her shoulder gently. His hand was warm and solid, and Ella felt something in her chest crack open at the simple kindness of the gesture. "We will get through this," he said. "All of us." Ella nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had been strong for so long, had held herself together through crisis after crisis, and this small moment of support threatened to undo her entirely. She blinked back unexpected tears and managed a shaky smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry's hand lingered for another moment, then he stepped back, giving her space. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." He walked back to the cabin, and Ella stood alone by the well, watching the last light fade from the sky and trying to understand the tangle of emotions in her chest. She barely knew Henry Thornton, had met him less than a day ago, but already she felt drawn to him in ways that frightened her. She could not afford complications, could not afford to think about anything beyond survival and getting her father the help he needed. But as she followed Henry back inside, she could not quite shake the warmth of his hand on her shoulder, or the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. The next week fell into a rhythm that became almost comfortable. They would rise early, eat breakfast together, then spend the day searching for and gathering the scattered mares. Thomas stayed at the cabin most days, tending the growing herd and resting his failing lungs. Ella and Henry worked together with increasing ease, developing a silent communication that made the difficult work flow smoothly. Ella learned that Henry was 30 years old and had never been married, that he preferred coffee black and could cook better than most men she had met, that he had a dry sense of humor that snuck up on you when you least expected it. She learned that he was unfailingly patient with the horses and equally patient with her father, never showing frustration with Thomas's limitations or making him feel useless. She also learned that being near Henry made her pulse quicken, and her thoughts scatter in ways that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with the way his shirt pulled tight across his shoulders when he roped a skittish mare, or the way his rare smiles transformed his weathered face into something almost beautiful. It was dangerous, this growing attraction. Ella had no room in her life for romance, no space for the kind of distraction that could make her lose focus on what really mattered. But telling herself that did not stop her heart from jumping every time Henry's hand accidentally brushed hers, or stop her from watching him when she thought he was not looking. On the 5th day, they found a group of 8 mares in a stand of cottonwoods near a seasonal creek bed. The horses were more skittish than the others had been, and it took hours of careful work to get them moving in the right direction. At one point, a gray mare broke away from the group, heading straight for open country, and Ella reacted on instinct. She kicked her horse into a gallop, rope already spinning as she chased the fleeing mare. The desert floor was rough and treacherous, studded with rocks and thorny bushes, but Ella focused only on the horse ahead of her. She made the throw at full speed, and the rope settled true around the mare's neck. Ella brought her own mount to a sliding stop, controlling the panicked mare until she settled enough to lead. When she turned back, she found Henry watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," Henry said, but his eyes were warm. "Just thinking that I have never met anyone quite like you, Ella Harrison." Heat flooded Ella's cheeks, and she looked away, flustered in a way that annoyed her. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "You always do what needs to be done. I have noticed that about you." Henry moved his horse closer, his gaze intent on her face. You carry the weight of the world on your shoulders and make it look easy. It is not easy, Ella admitted quietly. I know. That is what makes it impressive. They held eye contact for a long moment, and Ella felt the air between them grow thick with something unspoken. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she found herself leaning slightly toward Henry without meaning to. Then the mare she was holding jerked on the rope, breaking the moment, and Ella forced herself to focus back on the work at hand. But she felt Henry's gaze on her as they guided the horses back toward the cabin, felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. That evening after dinner, Thomas excused himself early to rest, leaving Ella and Henry alone by the fire. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the crackle of flames and the distant calls of the horses outside. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said finally. "Of course." "What do you want, Ella? Not what your father needs or what you think you should want. What do you actually want for yourself?" The question caught Ella off guard. No one had asked her that in years, maybe ever. She had spent so long focused on survival and taking care of her father that her own wants had become invisible, even to herself. "I do not know any more," she said honestly. "I used to want a home, a place that was mine where I could stay and build something lasting. But that seems like a foolish dream now." "Why foolish?" "Because people like me do not get to have homes. We get to keep moving and hoping the next town will be better than the last one." Ella heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to soften it. "I am not complaining. My life could be worse, but I stopped letting myself want impossible things a long time ago." Henry was quiet for a moment, his creek water eyes reflecting the firelight. "I do not think wanting a home is impossible. Difficult maybe, but not impossible. You live in the mountains alone. You said yourself you prefer the high country." "I do. But that does not mean I never get lonely or that I would not trade some of that solitude for the right kind of company." He shifted slightly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I guess what I am trying to say, rather badly, is that sometimes we deny ourselves things because we think we do not deserve them or cannot have them. But maybe we are wrong." Ella's throat felt tight. "Are we still talking about me?" Henry's gaze met hers, direct and unflinching. "I am talking about both of us." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ella's pulse raced, and she felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. "Henry," she started, not knowing what she wanted to say. "You do not have to respond," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know, in case it matters." "It matters," Ella whispered, "but I do not know what to do with it. My life is complicated right now. I know, and I am not asking you to figure everything out tonight." Henry reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and gentle. "I am just asking you to consider that maybe you deserve good things too. That maybe we both do." Ella looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-darkened skin and her paler fingers. Something in her chest expanded, pushing against her ribs like it was trying to break free. "I will consider it," she said softly. Henry smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. He squeezed her hand once, then let go, though the warmth of his touch lingered. They talked for a while longer, the conversation flowing easily now that the unspoken tension had been acknowledged. Eventually, Ella excused herself to sleep, and she lay in her rope bed listening to Henry move around the cabin, banking the fire and preparing his own bedroll. Her thoughts churned as she stared at the dark ceiling. She was attracted to Henry, that much was obvious. But it was more than physical attraction, though heaven knew his muscular frame and gentle hands stirred things in her she had not let herself feel in years. It was the way he looked at her like she was capable and strong, The way he treated her father with respect despite Thomas's diminished state. The way he moved through the world with quiet confidence and unexpected kindness. She could fall in love with a man like Henry Thornton. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange, tentative hope. The next morning dawned clear and warm, and they set out to find the last of the scattered mares. According to Henry's tracking, there were only 10 horses left to locate, and he thought he knew where they might have gone. There is a series of caves about 8 miles northeast of here, he explained as they rode. Natural shelter and a spring nearby. If I were a horse looking for a safe place to hide, that is where I would go. They found the horses exactly where Henry predicted, a group of 10 nervous mares clustered near the mouth of a shallow cave. Getting them out required careful planning and even more careful execution. But by mid-afternoon, they had the last of the herd moving back toward the cabin. Thomas was waiting when they arrived, and Ella could see the pride in his eyes as they guided the final mares into the corral. The entire herd was together now, 31 horses counting the stallion, all accounted for and ready to be delivered to the ranch outside Prescott. "You two did it," Thomas said, shaking Henry's hand and then pulling Ella into a rare hug. "I am impressed as hell." "Could not have done it without your daughter," Henry said, his eyes on Ella. "She is the best partner I have ever worked with." Warmth flooded through Ella at the praise and at the word partner, which felt weighted with more meaning than just their work together. They celebrated that night with a better dinner than usual, using supplies Henry had been saving for when the job was complete. The mood was light and hopeful, and even Thomas seemed to have more energy than usual. They talked and laughed, and Ella felt something loosen in her chest. Some knot of tension she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. After Thomas went to bed, Ella and Henry sat outside under the stars. The night was cool and clear, and the horses made soft sounds in their makeshift corral. "We leave for Prescott tomorrow," Henry said. "It is a 2-day drive with the herd." "And then?" Ella asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "Then I collect the payment and the bonus, give you and your father your share, and—" He trailed off, looking at her sideways. "I was hoping maybe you would not leave right away. Stay in Prescott for a bit, let your father see that doctor. Let me take you to dinner like a proper gentleman courting a proper lady." Ella's heart stuttered at the word courting. "You want to court me?" "Very much, if you would allow it." Henry turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the starlight. "I know the timing is not ideal, and your father needs to be your priority right now. But I would like the chance to see where this could go, to see if what I feel when I am with you could grow into something lasting. What do you feel when you are with me?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry reached out and cupped her face with one large, gentle hand. "Like I have finally found what I have been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. Like I could build a home with you and it would be enough, more than enough, for the rest of my life." Tears stung Ella's eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, had ever made her feel so seen and valued. "I do not have much to offer you," she said. "No money, no prospects, just a sick father and a life of wandering." "You have yourself," Henry said simply. "That is more than enough." Ella leaned into his touch, closing her eyes against the overwhelming surge of emotion in her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would like that. The courting and the dinner and seeing where this goes." Henry's smile was brilliant even in the darkness. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was chaste and respectful, but it sent warmth cascading through Ella's entire body. "Thank you," he murmured against her skin. They sat together for a while longer, Henry's arm around her shoulders and Ella's head resting against his solid chest. She could hear the steady beat of his heart, strong and reassuring, and she let herself imagine what it might be like to have this always, to have someone solid and dependable to lean on. The drive to Prescott took 3 days instead of 2, because Thomas had a bad coughing fit on the first day that forced them to stop and rest longer than planned. Henry never showed impatience or frustration, just set up camp and helped make Thomas comfortable while Ella fought her worry into submission. "He will be all right," Henry said quietly as they tended the horses that evening. "That doctor in Prescott is supposed to be the best in the territory." "I hope you are right," Ella said. She was exhausted from worry and from the strain of keeping herself together when all she wanted was to break down and scream at the unfairness of it all. Henry pulled her into a hug without asking, just wrapped his strong arms around her and held on. Ella let herself sink into his embrace, let herself take comfort in his solid warmth. They stood like that for a long time, and when they finally separated, Ella felt steadier than she had in days. They reached Prescott late in the afternoon of the 3rd day, driving the herd through streets that seemed impossibly crowded and loud after their time in the desert. The ranch was on the north side of town, a sprawling operation with good fences and well-maintained buildings. The ranch owner, a weathered man named Samuel Porter, was delighted with the condition of the horses. He counted them carefully, checked the stallion for injuries, and then paid Henry the agreed-upon price plus a substantial bonus. "You did fine work," Porter said, shaking Henry's hand. "If you are ever looking for steady employment, I could use someone with your skills." "I appreciate the offer," Henry said, "but I prefer to keep moving, though I will keep it in mind." True to his word, Henry split the money with Ella and Thomas, giving them a sum that made Ella's eyes widen. It was more money than they had seen in months, enough to pay for a doctor and medicine and maybe even a few weeks of rest while Thomas recovered. "This is too much," Thomas protested when Henry handed him the bills. "It is what we agreed on," Henry said firmly. "You two earned every cent." They took rooms at a modest hotel in town, and Henry arranged for the doctor to visit that evening. Dr. William Matthews was a serious man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. He examined Thomas thoroughly, listening to his lungs and asking detailed questions about his symptoms and history. "The consumption is advanced," he said finally, his tone grave. "I will not lie to you and say I can cure it. But there are treatments that can ease the symptoms and possibly slow the progression. It will require rest, good food, and consistent medicine." "Can you help him?" Ella asked, her voice tight with fear. "I can try. The question is whether you have the resources to maintain the treatment long term." Dr. Matthews named a price for his services and the medicine that made Ella's heart sink. Even with their earnings from the horse gather, it would not last more than a few months at best. "We will manage," Thomas said, but Ella could hear the defeat in his voice. After the doctor left, Ella sat with her father in his room trying to figure out how they could possibly make this work. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Even if Thomas could not work, they would burn through their savings in a matter of weeks. There was a knock at the door, and Henry entered at Thomas's invitation. He took one look at their faces and seemed to understand immediately. "The medicine is expensive," he said. It was not a question. "Very," Ella confirmed. "More than we can afford for long." Henry was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he said, "I have savings, not a fortune but enough to help." "We cannot accept that," Thomas said immediately. "You have already been more generous than we had any right to expect." "You can and you will," Henry said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because that is what people do for each other when they care. They help." "Henry," Ella started, overwhelmed by the offer. He turned to her, his creek-water eyes soft. "Let me do this, please." Ella wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to maintain her pride and independence, but her father's life was worth more than her pride. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Over the next week, they settled into a routine in Prescott. Thomas started his treatments with Dr. Matthews, and though he was often exhausted afterward, Ella thought she could see some small improvement. Henry took rooms across the hall from theirs and seemed in no hurry to leave town, though Ella knew he must be eager to get back to the mountains before winter arrived. He courted her properly, just as he had promised. He took her to dinner at a restaurant with real tablecloths and multiple courses. He walked with her through town, pointing out interesting buildings and shops. He bought her a book of poetry from a general store because she had mentioned once that she loved to read but rarely had access to books. Each small gesture chipped away at the walls Ella had built around her heart until she found herself falling helplessly, hopelessly in love with Henry Thornton. They were sitting in the hotel lobby one evening when Henry took her hand and said, "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led her outside and down the street to where a modest house sat on a corner lot. It had a wide porch and a garden that had gone to weeds, and there was a "for sale" sign posted by the front door. "What do you think?" Henry asked. "I think it is a lovely house," Ella said, confused. "But I do not understand why you are showing it to me, because I am thinking of buying it." Ella's heart stuttered. "You are thinking of staying in Prescott?" "I am thinking of staying wherever you are," Henry said. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I know we have not known each other long. I know this is sudden and may be foolish. But I am 30 years old and I have spent most of my life alone in the mountains, and then I met you and everything changed." "Henry," Ella whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength and your courage and the way you never give up even when things are impossible. I love how you care for your father and how you handled those wild horses and how you look at the world with hope even when you have every reason to be bitter. I want to build a life with you, Ella. A home, the kind of place you told me you always wanted." Tears streamed down Ella's face. "I love you too," she said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I have loved you since that first day when you tipped your hat to me. I was just too scared to let myself believe it could be real." Henry pulled her close and kissed her, properly this time, his lips warm and gentle against hers. Ella melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Let me take care of you and your father. Let me give you the home you deserve." "Yes," Ella said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a small church in Prescott with Thomas and Dr. Matthews as witnesses. Ella wore a simple blue dress that Henry had bought for her, and Henry wore new clothes that made him look civilized despite his mountain man appearance. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Henry kissed Ella with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Henry bought the house on the corner with part of his savings, and they moved in together as a family, Thomas included. The house needed work, but Henry threw himself into repairs with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. He fixed the roof and the porch, replanted the garden, and built Thomas a comfortable room on the ground floor so he would not have to manage stairs. Thomas's health improved slowly under Dr. Matthews's care. He would never be fully well, they all knew that, but the treatments gave him a quality of life he had not had in years. He could sit in the garden and read, could have conversations without being interrupted by coughing fits, could watch his daughter build a life with genuine contentment. Ella threw herself into making the house a home. She sewed curtains and cooked meals and filled the rooms with warmth and laughter. Henry proved to be an attentive and loving husband, thoughtful in ways both large and small. He brought her wildflowers from the hills surrounding town. He sat with her in the evenings and read aloud from her poetry book. He held her at night with protective strength that made her feel safe for the first time in years. Their physical relationship deepened with time and trust. Henry was gentle and patient, always attentive to Ella's comfort and pleasure. Their wedding night had been sweet and a little fumbling, both of them nervous despite their desire, but they learned each other's bodies with growing confidence and joy. Ella discovered that she loved the feel of Henry's muscular arms around her, loved the way his large hands could be so incredibly gentle, loved the rumble of his voice when he whispered endearments in the dark. And Henry seemed equally captivated by her, treating her like something precious and perfect. 3 months into their marriage, Ella realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mix of joy and terror. She wanted children, wanted to build a family with Henry, but she also remembered all too clearly the dangers of childbirth. Henry was overjoyed when she told him, his face splitting into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight, and then set her down carefully like she was made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "You are going to be a mother." "And you are going to be a father," Ella replied, her own happiness overcoming her fear. "A wonderful father, I know it." Henry placed his hand on her still flat stomach, his expression soft with love. "I am going to take care of you both, I promise." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Ella dealt with some morning sickness in the early months. Dr. Matthews monitored her carefully, and Henry hovered like a protective bear, always ready to fetch whatever she needed or help with any task. Thomas was delighted at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, and his health continued to hold steady throughout that year. Their son was born on a warm June evening in 1879, arriving after a long but uncomplicated labor. Dr. Matthews placed the squalling baby in Ella's arms, and she looked down at his tiny red face with overwhelming love. "He is perfect," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at his newborn son. "You are amazing. I cannot believe you just did that." They named him Daniel, after Henry's old mentor John's real first name that Ella learned he had rarely used. Daniel Thomas Thornton had his mother's dark hair and his father's eyes, and from the moment he was born, he had both parents wrapped completely around his tiny finger. Henry proved to be every bit the devoted father Ella had known he would be. He would wake in the night to walk with Daniel when the baby was fussy, would sing to him in a surprisingly good baritone, would hold him for hours just watching him sleep with an expression of pure wonder on his weathered face. Thomas delighted in his grandson, spending hours rocking the baby and telling him stories about his mother when she was young. The joy of being a grandfather seemed to give Thomas new energy, and Dr. Matthews commented on how well he was doing. The months turned into years with surprising speed. Daniel grew from an infant to a sturdy toddler with his father's solid build and his mother's determined spirit. The house filled with the sounds of childhood, with laughter and the patter of small feet and occasional tears that were quickly soothed. Henry continued to work, taking jobs as a scout and guide for settlers coming west, but he always came home to Ella and Daniel. The separations were hard but manageable, and the reunions were always joyful. Ella found work taking in sewing, and between her earnings and Henry's, they managed to keep ahead of expenses and even save a little. When Daniel was 3 years old, Ella discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, leaving her exhausted and sick for much of the early months. Henry cut back on his work to stay closer to home, and Thomas, despite his limited strength, helped care for Daniel when Ella needed to rest. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born in the spring of 1882. She was tiny and perfect, with her father's dark hair and her mother's hazel eyes, and she completed their family in ways Ella had not known they needed. Henry was just as devoted to Rose as he was to Daniel, cradling his daughter with infinite tenderness and fierce protectiveness. Ella often found him in the nursery late at night, just watching Rose sleep with an expression of such love it made her heart ache. "I never thought I could be this happy," Henry told her one night as they lay in bed together, their children sleeping soundly down the hall. "I spent so many years alone in those mountains, thinking that was all I would ever have. And then you threw that rope from a dead Gallop and everything changed. You changed my life too," Ella said, turning to face him in the darkness. "You gave me a home and a family and a reason to believe in good things again." Henry kissed her softly, his hand coming up to cradle her face. "I love you more than I have words for. You know that, right?" "I know. I love you too." They made love quietly, mindful of their sleeping children, their bodies moving together with the practiced ease of long familiarity. Afterward, Ella lay in Henry's arms and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong, and felt grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. Thomas's health began to decline again when Rose was 2 years old. The treatments had given him 6 good years, far more than any of them had hoped for, but the disease was finally winning. He faced his approaching death with grace and acceptance, spending his remaining time with his grandchildren and telling Ella how proud he was of her. "You built something real," he said to her one afternoon as they sat together in the garden. "Something lasting. I could not be happier with how your life turned out." "I learned from the best," Ella said, her voice tight with emotion. "You taught me to never give up, even when things seemed impossible." Thomas smiled, the expression weak but genuine. "You were always stronger than me, honey. You just needed someone to believe in you the way Henry does." "I wish you could stay longer," Ella whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I wish you could see the kids grow up." "I have seen enough to know they will be wonderful," Thomas said. He reached out and squeezed her hand. "And I will see your mother again soon." "That is something to look forward to." Thomas died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, Henry and Ella at his bedside. They buried him in the Prescott Cemetery with a simple headstone that read, "Thomas Harrison, beloved father and grandfather." Ella grieved deeply but found comfort in her family and in knowing that her father had lived to see her happy and settled. Life continued its steady forward march. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning. Rose was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and getting into mischief. Henry's hair started to show silver at the temples, and Ella found laugh lines forming around her eyes. They were happy in the way that real life allows, with challenges and difficulties mixed with joy and love. When Daniel was 10 and Rose was 7, Ella discovered she was pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. She was 34 years old and had assumed her childbearing years were behind her, but nature apparently had other plans. This pregnancy was the hardest yet, leaving her sick and exhausted. Dr. Matthews, now in his 70s but still practicing, monitored her closely and warned her to rest as much as possible. Henry was frantic with worry, barely letting Ella lift a finger, while Daniel and Rose tried their best to help around the house. Their third child, another son they named Thomas after Ella's father, was born in the winter of 1889. The labor was difficult and frightening, and for several hours Henry thought he might lose both Ella and the baby. But Dr. Matthews was skilled, and both mother and son survived, though the experience left Henry shaken in a way Ella had never seen before. "I cannot lose you," he said that night, holding Ella's hand as she recovered. "Promise me I will never lose you." "I am not going anywhere," Ella assured him, squeezing his hand weakly. "I am too stubborn to die." Henry laughed through his tears and kissed her forehead. "That is my girl." Little Thomas was a colicky baby who rarely slept and cried more than he was quiet. Between caring for the infant, managing the household, and helping their older children, Ella and Henry were exhausted in ways they had not experienced since Daniel was born. But they muddled through together, supporting each other through the sleepless nights and overwhelming days. Eventually, Thomas outgrew his colicky phase and became a sweet, easy-going child who adored his older siblings. Daniel was patient and gentle with his little brother, while Rose was protective in her fierce way. The family dynamic shifted and settled into a new rhythm, and life felt full and rich despite its challenges. As the children grew, Henry began to slow down on his work, preferring to stay close to home rather than take long scouting jobs. He started a small business breaking and training horses, using the skills he had honed over a lifetime. It provided steady income and allowed him to work from home, which suited everyone perfectly. Ella continued her sewing work and discovered she had a talent for designing dresses. Women in Prescott began to seek her out specifically, and she found herself with more business than she could handle. The extra income allowed them to expand the house, adding rooms for the growing children and modernizing parts of the structure. The years passed in a blur of school programs and birthday celebrations and quiet family dinners. Daniel announced at 16 that he wanted to be a teacher, and both Ella and Henry supported his ambition wholeheartedly. Rose declared she wanted to be a veterinarian, an unusual goal for a young woman but one that suited her adventurous spirit perfectly. Thomas showed early talent with horses, following his father around the training corrals and asking endless questions. Henry's body began to show the wear of a lifetime spent in hard physical work. His knees bothered him on cold mornings, and his back sometimes ached after a long day. But he was still strong and capable, still the solid, protective presence that Ella had fallen in love with all those years ago. His hair was more silver than dark now, and his face was deeply lined, but Ella thought he had never been more handsome. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898 with a quiet dinner at home, their children serving as the meal's cooks and waiters. Daniel was 21 and in his final year of teacher training. Rose was 18 and working with the local veterinarian as an apprentice. Thomas was 9 and full of energy and mischief. After dinner, after the children had cleaned up and gone to bed, Henry and Ella sat together on the porch swing they had installed years ago. The evening was warm and clear, stars bright overhead, and they rocked gently in comfortable silence. "Do you remember that day in the desert?" Henry asked. "When you threw that rope from a dead Gallop and caught the stallion?" Ella smiled. "Of course I remember. That was the day my whole life changed." "Mine too." Henry took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I knew right then, watching you control that horse, that you were someone special, someone worth knowing." "You tipped your hat to me," Ella said softly. "I thought about that gesture for days afterward. It made me feel seen in a way I had not felt in years. I am glad I saw you." "I am glad you saw me." Henry lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. 20 years, Ella, 20 years of loving you, and it still does not feel like enough time." "We have plenty more years ahead of us," Ella said, leaning her head on his broad shoulder. "I hope so." I want to see our grandchildren someday. I want to grow old and cranky with you." Ella laughed. "You will never be cranky. You are too even-tempered. Give me time. I am working on it." They sat together as the night deepened, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling in for sleep. Ella thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, about the desperate girl who had thrown a rope at a stampeding herd and the mountain man who had tipped his hat in respect. She thought about all the struggles and triumphs, the losses and gains, the moments of fear and the moments of overwhelming joy. "I would not change anything," she said quietly, "even the hard parts, because they all led me here to this life with you." Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I feel the same way. Every choice, every hardship, every moment of loneliness in those mountains, all of it was worth it because it brought me to you." They kissed then, slow and sweet, with 20 years of love and commitment behind it. When they separated, Ella rested her forehead against Henry's, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and wood smoke and home. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too, always." The years continued their steady march forward. Daniel got married to a lovely young woman named Sarah and took a teaching position at the Prescott School. Rose was accepted to veterinary school in California, one of the first women in the program, and she attacked her studies with characteristic determination. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, and at 14 he was already an accomplished horseman. Henry and Ella became grandparents when Daniel and Sarah welcomed a daughter in 1901. They named her Elizabeth, and from the moment she was born, she had her grandparents thoroughly enchanted. Henry was surprisingly good with the baby, his large hands gentle as he cradled the tiny girl, and Ella delighted in being a grandmother. More grandchildren followed over the years. Daniel and Sarah had 3 children in total. Rose eventually married a fellow veterinarian and had 2 children. And Thomas, when he grew up and married, had 4 children who kept everyone on their toes. Henry and Ella's house remained the heart of the family, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. The rooms that had once echoed with the sounds of their own children's laughter now rang with the voices of their grandchildren. The garden Henry had replanted all those years ago flourished under Ella's care, providing flowers and vegetables in abundance. They grew old together gracefully, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing year. Henry's knees eventually required a cane for stability, and Ella's hands developed arthritis that made sewing difficult. But they adjusted and adapted, always supporting each other through the challenges of aging. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their entire family gathered to celebrate. The house was packed with children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. There was food and music and stories that had been told 100 times but never got old. Daniel stood up to make a toast, raising his glass high. "To my parents," he said, his voice warm with affection, "who showed all of us what real love looks like, who built a home and a family from nothing but determination and faith in each other, who have been our foundation and our example for as long as I can remember." To Henry and Ella, Rose added, her own glass raised, "the strongest people we know." Everyone drank to that, and Ella found herself crying happy tears as Henry's arm came around her shoulders. She looked around the room at her family, at the legacy she and Henry had built together, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Henry and Ella lay in bed together as they had for 40 years. Henry's hair was completely silver now, and Ella's was more gray than brown, but they still fit together perfectly. "We did all right," Henry said, his voice rough with age but still strong. "With our life, I mean, we did all right." "We did better than all right," Ella replied. "We did beautifully." Do you ever think about that day, about what would have happened if I had not been tracking that herd? If you had not thrown that rope, sometimes. But I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be. Henry chuckled softly. You are getting sentimental in your old age. I earned the right to be sentimental. 40 years of marriage gives me that privilege. Fair enough. Henry kissed the top of her head. I love you, Ella Thornton. I loved you when you were that fierce young woman on a tired mare, and I love you now as my partner and wife of 40 years. I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Ella said, her voice thick with emotion. My mountain man, my home, my everything. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, their hearts beating in steady synchronization. Outside, the Arizona night was cool and clear, stars bright in the endless sky. Inside, the house they had built together was warm and safe, filled with the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. More years passed, sweet and precious. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, both of them in their 70s but still sharp and engaged with life. Their family had grown beyond anything they could have imagined that day in the desert, with dozens of descendants carrying their legacy forward. Henry's health began to fail in his late 70s, his heart growing weak. Dr. Matthews had long since passed away, replaced by younger doctors who did their best, but could not stop the natural progression of age. Henry faced his declining health with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life, never complaining, always more concerned about Ella than himself. You need to promise me something, he said to her one afternoon as they sat in their garden. He was 82 years old, and each breath came with visible effort. Anything, Ella said, holding his hand tightly. Promise me you will keep living. Really living, not just existing. Our children and grandchildren need you. I need to know you will be all right. Henry, Ella started, her voice breaking. Promise me, Ella, please. I promise, she whispered, but you have to promise me something too. What is that? Promise me you know how much you were loved. How much you changed my life for the better. Promise me you know that everything good in my life came from that day when you tipped your hat to me. Henry's eyes, still that remarkable creek water blue despite his age, filled with tears. I know, and you need to know the same. You saved me, Ella. From loneliness and purposelessness and a life half-lived. You were my miracle. They sat together until the sun began to set, holding hands and remembering. That night, Henry died peacefully in his sleep with Ella beside him, his last words a whispered I love you that she would carry in her heart forever. The grief was immense, an ocean of loss that threatened to drown Ella. But she kept her promise to Henry. She kept living, kept engaging with her family, kept tending the garden and telling the grandchildren stories about their grandfather. She missed Henry with an intensity that never fully faded, but she also celebrated the incredible gift of having loved him and been loved by him for 52 years. Ella lived another 7 years after Henry's death, remaining sharp and engaged until the end. She died at the age of 83, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last coherent words a smile as she said, I can see him. He is waiting for me. They buried Ella next to Henry in the Prescott Cemetery, under a tree they had planted together years ago. The headstone reads simply, Henry and Ella Thornton, partners, lovers, forever together. Their descendants continued to gather at the house for years afterward, the building eventually becoming a cherished family landmark. The story of how Henry and Ella met became family legend, told and retold with each generation. The young woman who threw a rope from a dead Gallop to catch a wild stallion, and the mountain man who tipped his hat in respect and fell in love with her courage. It was a story of wild horses and the untamed Arizona desert, of two people finding each other against all odds and building something lasting from nothing but determination and love. It was a story that began with a desperate act of bravery and ended with a lifetime of happiness. It was, in every way that mattered, a story of home,